Three, two, one, here we go. RAINMAN'S Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. Want to introduce my guest, Dr. Jerry Hendrix. Jerry, how you doing today, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
No problem. No problem. So Jerry Hendrix works for a group called the Telemus Group. It's a consulting firm in DC, and they specialize in defense forecasting, wargaming, and qualitative analysis. He's a retired Navy captain and a geostrategist, and he's had several posts on several high-level staffs, including the Secretary of Defense's Office of Force Development. And he's also authored a number of cutting-edge studies on the need for a larger Navy, as well as the evolution of the carrier air wing. And I wanted to have Jerry on because he just published a book last December about the history of the U.S. Navy and the history of the free ocean concept. And I find that to be very prevalent, especially in today's world, if you watch the news and see what's going on around the oceans all over the world. So I wanted to have Jerry on as an expert to kind of help fill in some of the questions that I have. And I really appreciate you joining me. So thanks very much, Jerry.
Well, thank you. It's a fascinating subject, and I'm glad that there's others that are willing to listen to it, because I think it's growing in importance in our national dialogue as well as international relations. So I appreciate the chance to come on and chat with you.
Well, thank you very much. Why don't we start by just kind of filling in a little bit about your Navy background as well as what you're currently doing with the Telemus Group right now.
All right. I served 26 years, 3 months, 19 days in the Navy, all of them glorious. I cried like a baby on the day I retired. I grew up on a farm in Indiana, went in through an ROTC scholarship, and then I served the first half of my career tracking submarines, flying as a naval flight officer in airplanes, and really enjoyed that because it gave me the big picture in more ways than one. And then halfway through my career, 9/11 occurred, and I was actually working in Washington, D.C., not in the Pentagon on that day, but just away from the Pentagon. And that really fundamentally changed the direction, not only of my career, but also sort of the strategic direction of the nation. So the last half of my career, I really worked in strategy jobs. So I was working for the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, the head admiral of the Navy at that time, as a staff assistant for strategy. I ended up going off and getting a master's and then a doctorate degree after that. But I came back after I commanded an aviation squadron. I worked in OSD policy. For the Office of Force Development, as you mentioned. Then I worked for a guy named Andy Marshall, who was the director of net assessment, a 90-year-old guy who really was known for thinking strategically. And then I worked for the Secretary of the Navy, and then I was the director of naval history. I spent my last 2 years on active duty as sort of the chief historian of the fleet. But since then, I've been really working as a civilian analyst, looking at the strategic trends, whether it's demographic trends, economic trends, or military technology trends, trying to figure out where this is going, and it's not going to a good place. So I've been writing a lot about this over the last decade, about this coming conflict on a number of different scales with the Chinese and to a lesser degree the Russians, because they seem to be very focused on the sea because it's a global commons. It's an area where they feel they can compete without triggering us to go to war with them. So they're trying to find these places where they can compete and push back, gain greater control over either its information or commerce without necessarily wanting to go to war with the Americans. So the seas, cyberspace, and then space, these three sort of international commons areas, it's a lot of the area where this competition is coming. So I wrote a lot of articles, and those articles sort of called upon me, as it were, to sum them up, which is why I got around to writing this most recent book.
Nice. And the book is called To Provide and Maintain a Navy with Naval Primacy as America's First Best Strategy. And it came out in December of 2020. And one of the things that kind of reading through some of the parts of the book, the one thing that and I think this is probably going to be good in terms of setting the stage here, is just the history of what the concept of a free ocean and free seas and how that has sort of helped to propel our societies forward to the point where we are today. So why don't you kind of give a little bit of a set the table from there, and then we'll kind of hit what's going on currently around the world.
Thanks. I'm glad that you allow me to kind of unpack this, because it's a complicated topic, and it's one that, in fact, many ways we just take for granted. And when I say we, it's not only we, the people, sort of the general population of the country. We just take the idea that the seas are free and that they are safe. We take that for granted. But quite frankly, even our leadership, if you really get down and talk with many members of Congress, there's this built-in assumption that the seas are free and the seas are safe. So I wanted to go back and tell how we got here. And it's really important. The concept of the free sea, the idea that you can travel from one part of the ocean to another part of the ocean without being hindered or encumbered or attacked, that actually is an idea that emerges in the 17th century. So there's this Dutch legal jurist, Hugo Grotius, that's actually brought into this legal case. It's always kind of interesting. It's always the lawyers or the philosophers that this all comes from. But the Dutch had seized a ship that had been owned by Portugal. And at that point in time, Portugal and Spain essentially divided up the world's oceans between them. The Pope had said, Spain, you've got this half of the world's oceans. Portugal, you got that half of the world's oceans. And the Dutch, of course, not really following those rules, goes in and they seize this ship. Well, they're taken to court. And Grotius does this interesting thing in that he loses the case for his client, which is the Dutch, but he gains acceptance of this concept of the free sea, that under natural law, which is a kind of philosophical approach that you observe what happens in nature and you derive your law from that. Under natural law, there's nothing that stops, a ship from being blown across the ocean. There's not even a natural border or boundary like a river or a mountain range that we have on land. And so Grotius creates this concept of the free sea. And he makes this argument that no one should be able to encumber, not the Pope, not any other law, of one nation's ability to sail a ship across the ocean, buy goods where they are plentiful, and then transport them across the ocean and sell them where they are scarce. So this idea of free sea leads necessarily to free trade. And what's interesting about this is this idea comes out in about 1609. And the Enlightenment, which really creates Western thought, the way that we think of Western civilization today, which is really all around the basis of individual freedom, that derives from this initial Grotius idea that the free sea creates free trade, and free trade identifies or sort of illuminates the idea of individual freedom. And so a lot of what we consider to be accepted norms in the West go back to this original decision at the beginning of the 17th century. And so I tell that story within the book, and then I tell the story of the fact that this did not occur overnight. And in fact, for 400 years after Grotius wrote that decision, the seas weren't safe. There was piracy, there was war, there was literally hundreds of battles per century that occurred in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and even in the 1900s, right up to 1945. There are battles that are constantly going on. So ships, we didn't put a lot of commerce at sea. There was always a risk there. A lot of commerce went over land or by internal rivers. But after 1945, a funny thing happened on the way to the circus, as it were. And that is that the U.S. wins, and it wins. And at the moment it wins, it has over 6,000 ships in its Navy. And the British, our ally, have 1,800 ships in their Navy. And then third place are the defeated powers, and they're gone. So suddenly we emerge in 1945, and the seas are safe and they are free, mostly because the United States, a great upholder of Western norms and norms of the Enlightenment, they've emerged. We're the cop on the beach. And for the next 70 years, we establish that rule set, and then we uphold that rule set. And we essentially take that idea and we make it really the international rule, the international norm. But funny thing happens. We win the Cold War in about 1989, and suddenly we kind of stop investing in our Navy. And so at the end of the Cold War, we're at like 594 ships. And then we start selling off ships because there's no threat. We need the peace dividend. We want to invest in our country, and so on. And everyone else wants to invest in their countries. And so the British sell off their fleet. We sell off our fleet. By 2003, we're below 300 ships. And even though we were being looked upon to be the people to uphold these rules, we simply didn't have a fleet large enough anymore to uphold the rules, and the rules started to break down. And China and Russia, authoritarian states, they saw this and they said, you know, I'm a little uncomfortable with this concept of the free sea, because you know what comes across the free sea? Free ideas. Free ideas cause instability internally in our countries. So I want to control not only the commerce that comes into my country, but I want to control the ideas that come in. And that's kind of where we're at today, is the free sea is under threat as an idea.
Wow. One thing that stood out in your description just then, actually a couple minutes ago, was when you were talking about how they go to court over this, you know, in the 1600s. Where was that court? Was that at the Vatican, or where was that? Where was that taking place? Because that seems to be a fascinating part of that story.
So it's interesting, you know, one of the oldest courts that gets established, or forms of courts that gets established in the world, is admiralty courts. So at first, if you really want to think about where is international law being decided and adjudicated, it's being adjudicated in these admiralty courts. So the Dutch had an admiralty court, the Portuguese had one, the British ended up having one. You know, we in the United States, I think we still have 3 admiralty courts. One's in Norfolk, Virginia, one's in New York, and one's out in San Francisco, where international claims can be brought and then be adjudicated under not only your national law, but there are these accepted international norms, our admiralty norms, that the things get adjudicated. So this particular thing is taken up in an admiralty court, and it's actually settled in this sort of mediated central location at that point in time. But as I said, the Dutch end up losing the case, and the value of that ship that the Dutch had seized was actually worth enough to kind of run the Dutch government for 2 years. So this was not an insubstantial amount of money. This was a lot of money. But they lose that money, but in the end, they gain dramatically, because once that idea of the free sea is created and accepted, then this little thing called the Dutch East India Company is allowed to grow, blossom, and bloom, really creating this international environment for trade. But it also, I mean, the Dutch East India Company is the first stock traded company in the world, because no one could afford to build that company individually. So they actually sold stocks, and then individuals could buy shares in the Dutch East India Company, and then ultimately in the British East India Company. And suddenly we had a stock market. So again, ideas that are central to the West come out of these early experiences.
Yeah. And I remember watching a TV program about the history of New York City, and they were talking about the Dutch as the Dutch East India Company being like IBM, but with an army and a navy.
Yeah. And mind you, New York, New Amsterdam.
Yep.
I mean, Manhattan, Long Island is all part of an original Dutch, settlement. You know, and when you think about some of the great families of New York, like the Roosevelts, well, that's a Dutch family. So the Dutch and their laws and their norms and sort of their culture sort of permeate a lot of the West, specifically when it comes to commerce and trade.
Yeah. And one more tangent before we kind of start working our way up here. Is the U.S. law system, is that at all kind of impacted? Because I remember hearing something that really it's kind of most of the U.S. laws, at least from the start, was kind of based on maritime law. Is that the case, or is it kind of two separate legal?
Very much so. Very
Okay.
much so. So because we derive largely from maritime powers, I mean, the 13 original colonies are all settled by maritime powers, whether it's the Dutch originally, or whether it's the British or Spanish, they all sort of are deriving. So the view of the colonies is as extensions of a maritime trade system. So it was all about extracting resources from North America and bringing it home to the home countries. And so a lot of the early laws and the original settlements are all on the basis of maritime trade. So it's there in a large way, and it actually carries over. I mean, there's a reason I chose the title of the book, which is To Provide and Maintain a Navy, which is actually the direct quotation from the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. was founded as a maritime nation, as a sea power. And so even right there in our Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, which is where the Congress has the power to provide and maintain a Navy. So the Navy is permanent in the national interest of the United States at its founding. And it's kind of funny because if you look at Clause 11, which establishes the Army, the Army is to be raised, meaning the Army is not permanent, but the Congress has the authority to raise an Army, but the Navy must be provided and maintained. So the founders very clearly understood that the nation was primarily a sea power, that its interests lay across the oceans. And so the Navy had to be a permanent entity to protect those national interests associated with trade. So it's kind of one of those interesting things. The Army gets really uncomfortable when we bring this up in polite conversations at the Army-Navy Club, but the fact is it's right there in the founding document. We're here to stay. You guys can come and go.
Yeah, and what's near and dear to my heart as a former Marine, in 1775, they established the Marine Corps basically to be the soldiers protecting the ships, right?
Absolutely. We needed the sharpshooters and the security on board the ships.
Yep.
So, of course, where did we go? We go to a tavern so we can find enough guys of the right mindset to become U.S. Marines. And so the Marines, we still, till this day, I think, do quite a bit of recruiting in and around taverns and bars.
I represent, or I think anyway, not to.
Yep.
Anyway, I always love that story. Real quick before we get kind of working our way towards modern, I did want to ask you this because it does kind of come into play, especially with what we're seeing with China right now. But even before the 1600s, I read a book, I think it was called 1492, and it talked about there was a Chinese emperor that basically had this fleet that was just a kind of a globally dominant fleet, and they would travel all over, basically all over the world in these big, massive ships that, and then literally the next emperor that comes along pretty much just shuts the door on China and gets rid of that fleet. Is that kind of, at least my impression is China seems to be going back to those days when they dominated the world, or am I off base there?
So the Chinese actually spend a lot of time today talking about the treasure fleet of the Ming Dynasty, because it occurs during one particular imperial reign that emperor makes this massive investment in the treasure fleet under the leadership of an admiral by the name of Cheng He. And Cheng He builds these ships, which are huge. They're massive. They're almost 6 times as large, for instance, than some of the ships that brought American colonists to the United States, like the Mayflower. These are tremendously large things, and they're built upon lines of naval architecture that, quite frankly, we would never approach, mostly because they built them as sort of extensions of their sampan fleet of operating the East China Sea, South China Sea, where they had sort of trade networks that were built up between them and tributary states. And these 6 voyages of Cheng He move from China around all the way to Africa and up into the Arabian Gulf. They have lots of implications in the Indian area. There's even these suggestions that they sailed eastward towards North America, although we haven't really been able to establish that in an archaeological way. We found no wreckage or something like that, although we keep looking. But the point there is the Chinese come back to this one moment. This era only lasts a few decades during this one imperial reign. And you're right, the next emperor comes in and he shuts that down and sort of takes China internal, because in looking at continental threats, the Chinese across their nearly 3,000-year history have largely been dominated in their security thinking by threats that come across land. And in fact, China itself, grew from one state and then absorbed 4 other states and then absorbed about 7 other states. And then you think about Manchuria and so on. Every time China grows, it's to absorb an outer threat, but the threats are always coming from the land. So they have this continentalist viewpoint, except the last 2 threats that have come to China have come from the sea. So the Japanese invasion in the 1930s, and before that, the Western colonial invasion, whether it was the Portuguese, the British, and then in the 1800s, those both came from the seas. And so China here recently has become aware that there is a threat out there, and the threat comes from the east, from the Pacific Ocean. But their approach to it, and I get into this in the book, is when China feels threatened, what do? They build walls. We all know about the Great Wall of China and that you can see it from space, But the Great Wall is actually one of only, I think, about 14 walls that they've created over their history. Every time they face a threat, they build a new wall. Well, what we're seeing right now in the South China Sea with these artificial islands that they've been created, those are really, as Admiral Harry Harris, who's the former Indo-Pacific commander, he called that China's Great Wall of Sand. And I think that Admiral Harris hit it right on the head. The Chinese are once again trying to wall themselves off from an outer threat by building a defensive wall in the Pacific.
Yeah, and obviously that's I mean, right now the Philippines are worried, Taiwan's obviously worried, and yeah, and that's kind of that standoff, right, where the Chinese are kind of tapping at us, being like, hey, this is what we can do over Taiwan, or this is what we can do with that reef right by the Philippines. What are you going to do about it? And like you said earlier, they don't necessarily want to push it to the point where there's bullets going down range, but what are they, in your opinion, how do they think we're reacting?
Well, they've been very disturbed here as of late. Obviously, I mean, China's modern era really begins, this latest sort of iteration of their foreign policy begins in 2008, when the massive global downturn really, roils the global economy and sets it back tremendously. But China's actually able to weather that storm better than a lot of the other nations because it had a centrally controlled economy. And what it did, rather than sort of shrink, is that it kept spending, and it's kept its people working by first either building ships, for instance, or building towns that, quite frankly, have never been filled with people. But they kept their people at work so that they didn't have a massive recession. And there were a lot of Western observers that kind of looked at that and said, they may be onto something, this idea of the centrally controlled economy. There was even a New York Times op-ed writer who said, it would be great to be China for a day in the United States so that we could do massive reforms, to have the power of Xi Jinping, the leader of China, to do sort of reforms to the U.S. economic system. But of course, the Chinese have advantages and they have disadvantages. But they made a decision after 2008. They got this sense of confidence. The moment was theirs. History was coming to them. And they felt like now was the time to sort of announce China's rise. And so they became much more aggressive in their foreign policy. And they started looking at their neighbors and saying, the time is coming. You're going to have to make a choice between the United States and the West or siding with us. And we're going to be the growing economy. We've got 1.4 billion people. We've got a surging economy that's becoming increasingly productive. You really want to align with us. And so since 2008, they've been drumbeating that part of their foreign policy to try and coerce the rest of the world to align with them. And at the same time, we were distracted. I mean, we were in Iraq, we were in Afghanistan, we were dealing with the war on terrorism, and we weren't really focused on what's coming next, by and large, here in the United States. And so for about 10 years, they were able to really go. But then a funny thing happened, which was the election of President Trump caused sort of a sea change in U.S. foreign policy. Whereas we had really talked about a cooperative policy with China up until President Trump was sworn in, Trump, because of his business background, really sort of looked at that and says, I don't like this rate of exchange. I don't like the trade deficit. Trump seemed to instinctively understand that the Chinese were vulnerable on both ends of their economy. And by that, I mean, China has no natural resources. It's one of the most resource poor countries in the world. And so whether it's their energy or whether it's the raw ores that they need to build their economy, that all comes from Africa, Australia, and even South America. So they're dependent on imports. And then also the Chinese, even though they've got 1.4 billion people, they have virtually no middle class. And so they cannot afford to buy the cell phones or the computers or the high-end tech things that the Chinese economy is producing. So they're dependent upon Europe and the United States to purchase. So when President Trump comes in and he imposes the trade war on the Chinese, and then he starts to become more aggressive with the U.S. Navy in and around China's sea lines of communication, I think the Chinese kind of freaked out. And so we started to see this wolf warrior diplomacy start to rise up, where they were no longer trying to sort of suggest to other nations in the region that they start tilting their way. They started to berate these other nations in the region to start tilting their other way. It was a moment of panic because the Chinese are facing a number of trends, economic, demographic, and military trends that are all coming home to roost. Their one-child policy from the 1960s and 70s has long-term implications.
Yeah.
So very soon, you're going to have one child who is going to be supporting in a social structure, kind of like our Social Security system. That one child is going to be called upon to provide for 2 parents and 4 grandparents. Okay, that's an upside down and underwater economic situation, no matter how you look at it. And so that's going to come due. That bill comes due in the 2030s. So the Chinese knew that they had to become great before they got old. And that clock is ticking. And that's why you see them starting to move out so strongly now to try and secure their central position as a hegemonic power in the Western Pacific. And that's why I'm very, very concerned at the growing risk of, quite frankly, outright war between us and the Chinese, because they are reacting much more emotionally in their foreign policy.
Interesting. And kind of along with what you just said there, where they were relying on imports, but you see that they're basically taking over Africa. I mean, they're moving to Africa, they're moving into South America. So it's almost like it could almost look at it like it's actually not really an import because they've got so much influence in those areas that it's just basically like sending that stuff back to home base type of a situation. So basically from like 2000 to 2015, let's call it, while we were focused on the war on terrorism, Iraq, Afghanistan, and they're just kind of quietly doing their thing. Is it quietly, or is it we just weren't paying attention? Because I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, they had a phrase that they used, which was "bide your time." So they had a bide your time foreign policy where they were trying to keep their heads low. They were trying to stay under the radar. They were trying to get as much forward economic advancement as well as diplomatic advancement, as well as starting to modernize their military during those times. But it was 2008 where they sort of arrived and sort of felt like they had the wind behind them. And they said, okay, the bide your time moment is over. It's now time to announce China's arrival. And so, for instance, you remember the Beijing Olympics, the coming out party, as it were, and they really wanted that to be super successful because it was going to announce that China was, quote unquote, not a developing nation anymore. It was a great power. And they wanted sort of to announce their presence with authority, if I may quote one of my favorite lines from Bull Durham. But what it did is it woke everybody else up very quickly. There was an incident that went on between them and the Japanese right around this time when they were trying to bully the Japanese in the East China Sea. And the Japanese, there was a Chinese fishing captain who actually rammed a Japanese naval ship. And the Japanese said, "You're under arrest." And they took him back home to Japan for breaking admiralty law. Well, the Chinese sort of stepped up and said, "You're going to turn that guy back over and you're not going to put him on trial." This is around 2011, 2012. And by the way, you're going to apologize to us for this. But we had video of this fishing boat captain actually ramming a Japanese ship. So the evidence was fairly clear. And the Japanese said, "No, we're not going to do it." And the Chinese said, "Well, then we are cutting off your supplies of rare earth elements for your factories, for all the Japanese factories." And so the Chinese did. They cut off the Japanese supplies of this because China had essentially total control of the rare earth element market at that time. Well, the Japanese said no. And the Chinese suddenly had nothing else to do except actually ratchet it up and do something more military. But what that also created was suddenly the entire world looked around and said, "Oh my gosh, these guys are bullies. Look what they're doing. They're using economic coercion," because they will say to the Japanese, "You don't have the right to prosecute a Chinese citizen who is obviously breaking, an obvious international law." Yeah. Well, in the end, China had to sort of step back down off from that. They had to have a mediated point. But and then you also remember, there's been a number of different incidents, but the point here is the Chinese sort of came out, and they came out loudly And now they really don't know how to back down from some of these foreign policy positions they've taken. They want these other nations of Europe, or not Europe, of Asia, to start paying almost homage to them as the central middle kingdom again that was traditional back in the time of the Ming Dynasty. Right. And they want to recreate those bilateral relationships. And they think the United States should have nothing to do with the western part of the Pacific.
Yeah, that, and what I find fascinating, and I don't think many people realize this, is that whole rare earth materials industry and how reliant the U.S. is on that. Not only just military weapons, but you're also hearing in the news now about, we've got a shortage of microchips for basically everything, and rare earths have a lot to do with all of that stuff. So in a sense, we've got a pretty precarious situation as far as that's concerned with the Chinese.
Well, we're awake to it now. And one of the things that's happened over the last several years is we started taking an inventory and started looking like in our shipbuilding industry, how much, how robust is that shipbuilding industry? Well, there are certain components in our shipbuilding industry that there's only one supplier in the United States. We're totally dependent on one supplier of the key element of shipbuilding, or in some cases, we are totally dependent on a foreign supplier of those. In some cases, even the Chinese themselves, we're dependent on them for key components of what it is that we're building in our defense industry. And so we're awake to this. And so, for instance, on rare earths, we used to have a working rare earth mining corporation in the United States, but it shut down because the Chinese underbid or flooded the market with cheap supplies, and they drove all their competitors out. That's one of the reasons that they were able to gain a near monopoly over rare earths. Well, the U.S. government, under the Defense Production Act, essentially said, no, I need to have that ability to have that industry, that if I were to go to war at some point in time or have a national emergency, I need a domestic source for that. And so essentially the U.S. government got behind restarting up that company and putting orders in for it. Even though we may have to purchase that at a higher price than we could on the open global market, it is in our national interest that we have that fact, or that particular company, producing in the United States. One of the things, and this comes back to the strength of the United States versus the weakness of China, and something that if you really look at it, becomes pretty obvious to anyone. The Chinese, as I said, are totally dependent on import of raw materials and export of finished goods. They cannot do it on their own. They cannot go internal and keep their economy running. The United States, oddly enough, can. We are what's called an autarkic economy. If we really had to, and I'm not saying it would be the most efficient or the cheapest, we have enough raw resources here in North America that we could actually create our own energy, oil, natural gas, raw resources, iron, copper. We have enough here that we could go on internal and actually have our economy go in a wartime situation. We choose not to because the free market provides us cheaper sources of those materials and even cheaper sources of labor. But the fact of the matter is we need to understand what it is that we have, and we understand the strength upon which we stand. And we need to be ready to move to that and activate aspects of our economy in a time of national emergency. And I think we've begun to wake up to this. And I think the Chinese are awake to it as well. They understand that, for instance, if the U.S. Navy was to blockade and not allow raw resources, whether it's energy out of the Middle East or ores coming out of Australia and South America, if we just say, you can't go to China, and we use the Navy to do that, the Chinese economy starves. Or if the U.S. does a trade embargo and says, I'm not buying your phones, and by the way, I'm going to call upon my European allies, then the Chinese economy starves. So I think that's one of the things that they woke up to over the last 3 years in the trade war that they had with the United States, is that we're aware of their weakness, and it kind of freaks them out, which is one of the reasons why you've seen them getting so shrill in their international pronouncements here as of late. So, methinks it shows a sign of weakness, as it were.
Interesting, because that was the one thing that was big on Trump's plate, was he wanted the U.S. to be energy independent. And so everything that he was doing, the pipelines, the drilling, all of those things was geared towards, just like you said, U.S. not having that one thing that somebody can hold over their heads. And my personal opinion, just as a Joe U.S. citizen, the new Biden administration comes in and reverses all of that. So we're right back to kind of leaving that door wide open to somebody to exert some sort of influence on us.
Well, there's definitely some aspects of the Biden economic policies that I'm really troubled by, like shutting down the Keystone Pipeline and pulling the permits on that, and other aspects where we seem to take our environmental policy and place it as a higher priority than our economic policy. In a time of conflict, that's going to come back and bite us. But at the same time, I've been pleased that the Biden administration has continued some of the strident language vis-a-vis China. I mean, Secretary Blinken has come out and he repeated Secretary Pompeo's statement that China is a genocidal nation, which is great. And they've continued to kind of bring pressure to bear. And we've also seen some of that go on with Russia as well. So there's actually been an odd continuity in some of the foreign policy between them. I think there's some issues with domestic economic policy because that also influences domestic politics. I'm not much good at politics. I mean, I'm a guy that's here to build a larger Navy because I see the Navy as our window to the world. It's the cop on the beat in the international environment. And right now, our police force, as it were, just simply isn't large enough to patrol the neighborhoods anymore where we have interests and concerns.
Yeah, and that was, I might as well ask it right now while I have it on fresh in my head. And again, forgive my ignorance here. Biden's last proposal for the military budget, I think it was something like $759 billion, and people were chirping that that's crazy. Is that crazy huge or is that crazy small? And in that, does he have any plan of increasing the size of the Navy?
So we don't know yet because that's just simply a top line advice from the Office of Budget and Management, OMB, is the 759, of which 715 goes to DOD hard services. The other things are other aspects of defense spending. That represents a slight plus up over the last Trump budget. However, it's not enough to keep up with inflation. So in real terms of real dollars, it's a smaller defense budget than what we were expecting. We really need 3 to 5% year-over-year growth in DOD to continue to grow the defense budget. Now, what's amazing, of course, everyone hears something like 715 billion or 759, and they think, oh my gosh, that's ginormous. You know, that's a huge budget. But in fact, if you look historically across the Cold War, from 1945 through 1989, the U.S. during a time of great power competition generally on average spent about 4.4% of its GDP on its defense in a Cold War competition. This budget represents 3.78%. If we were doing just a flat 4% of GDP, our GDP right now is just shy of $21 trillion, then we'd be spending about $840 billion a year on defense, and that would be the norm historically across that. Now, there's a lot of people that say this is enormous and we can't afford to do this, and we need to take a cut in order to afford other things. I think that ignores the geostrategic environment we're in. You know, we are facing not one, but two great power competitors right now. And I'm here to tell you, if we go to war, we're going to war with both of them. There is no geostrategic scenario where I see China making a move in the South China Sea or against Taiwan that Russia does not simultaneously make a move to reclaim its sphere of influence in Ukraine or even into the Baltic regions. They are coordinated enough now that they will move out simultaneously, betting that the United States cannot cover a two-front conflict. And that's a pretty good bet right now, to tell you the honest truth. So the fact of the matter is the number is kind of misleading. It seems large, but the fact is it's not large enough. We need a naval fleet. I call for a naval fleet of 456 ships. Well, if you're going to do that, you know, you're going to have to increase the Navy budget on average between 30 to 50 billion dollars over the next 10 years. So I'm not saying jack me up 50 billion next year. Quite frankly, the shipbuilding industrial base couldn't take that amount of money. Yeah. But I need to come up with a 10-year plan to grow the Navy. I make the suggestion even within the book that right now, the preponderance of our competition is at sea. So perhaps some of that money could come from actually decreasing the size of the budget of some of our sister services to increase the size of the Navy first and then the Air Force, which also because of the role of long-range strike and bombers, is going to have a role to play in some of these global competitions. But the point is right now the money is not enough. It's going to have to grow, and we do have to be smarter about spending our money. We need to look at what works and what doesn't work, and we need to be prepared to shed sunk costs that are no longer relevant in this future competition that we're looking at.
Yeah, and this is probably a subject for another interview in terms of the Marine Corps and the reevaluation that's going on right now with the Marine Corps.
No, General Berger, the new Commandant of the Marine Corps, has really got some innovative ideas, and they're much needed. I mean, let's face it, it's how long has it been since we invaded Incheon, the last major amphibious assault? And the likelihood of another major amphibious invasion is relatively low. And yet the Marine Corps has been sort of focused doctrinally and infrastructure-wise on amphibious assault as sort of their reason for being. I love my brother and sister Marines. I sailed with them. I went out with the 11th MEU on my last operational deployment on an amphibious ready group. So I watched them up close in person, and there's no more dedicated warriors for our nation than them. But the fact is we need to get their services aligned with a mission that is necessary and that they can perform with their unique elite approach to warfare and training. And so I really encourage the Commandant, and I'm pleased with what he's looking at, sort of the distributed Marine force, disaggregated force spread out across smaller ships, working in the archipelagic islands of the Western Pacific, for instance. It's actually something very much throwback to some of their thinking in the 1930s when they were thinking about the advanced basing force that you may know Pete Ellis, who was one of the strategic geniuses of the Marine Corps prior to World War II. I think we're seeing some of that today, and I encourage it. I'd love to come back on and talk to you more about that.
Yeah, and as I would love that as well. So in terms of, and as you were saying that, I just popped into my head. So one of the Spratly Islands that the Chinese basically turned into an airfield. If push came to shove and the bullets start flying, we wouldn't necessarily do an amphibious landing on that base. We would just bomb it into the ocean, right?
Yeah, it's relatively small. There's 4 islands that they've sort of reclaimed from coral and sand and built and put these long runways on there. Quite frankly, they're kind of perfect targets, specifically given sort of the long-range standoff weapons we have, whether it's tomahawks, LRASMs, or other types of weapons that are coming. I appreciate it, actually. That gives me something to do on the first day for some of the longer range and perhaps older weapon systems that I have. And that also gives me something to attack that is not legally Chinese territory. I mean, no one under an international law believes any of those islands are actually legal Chinese territory. So if you have a hesitance about striking China on the mainland because I don't want them to hit my mainland, well, great. They just gave me 4 candidate targets that I can hit under all international law and have no problem with whatsoever. So
that is, and it wouldn't be considered an act of war then.
That's absolutely correct. They've created an artificial island, which has given me a very real target. So that's one way of looking at it. And then that also gives me a chance to really signal my intentions without necessarily having a penalty in international court in front of the eyes of the international audiences. I mean, there was a ruling against the Chinese in the International Tribunal at The Hague, where they were essentially told, you have no legal claim over these, and these are artificial entities. And so it's like, okay, great, thank you. From my standpoint, again, and the Philippines can hit them, the Vietnamese can hit them, we can hit them, the Japanese. It's essentially sort of a free jump ball for us to go ahead and do that on day one if the Chinese choose to jump ugly with us.
And it's fascinating because essentially those 4 islands are like aircraft carriers that are dead in the water.
Yeah, and so
go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I mean, we all talk about aircraft carriers or large airfields that can move, and can move 1,000 miles a day. These islands aren't going anywhere. I mean, I've got them as mensurated coordinates. They're probably already dialed into numerous different missiles, so we know exactly where they are, and they're going to be that same place tomorrow.
So as a guy who's just, as a civilian now, who's just watching the news and I remember when the news first started covering this, I was like, what are we doing letting them do this? This is crazy. But now that you mentioned that, what it is It's almost like them just saying, hey, look at us. We're the big tough guy now, except they didn't really think it through because what we were just talking about.
So yes, they didn't really think it through because they've created a vulnerability. As any place that they build that's away from their shores is a vulnerability for them strategically. Yeah. So I'll give you an example of something that just happened. I mean, the Chinese sailed these 190 naval militia ships into Whitsum Reef, which is within the Philippines' extended economic zone. And they parked them there, and everyone started looking at this because this is exactly what the Chinese have done in the past when they were going to create one of these artificial islands. So we were all waiting kind of for the dredging ships to show up to start dredging up the sand and creating another island. But the Philippines reacted rather strongly. The Philippines said, well, I've had just about enough of you. So they started flying out their aircraft and buzzing these Chinese ships. And then all of a sudden, the Philippines started putting out a small naval task force to go out there to sail. But then the Vietnamese put the sea, and then the Japanese put the sea. And then suddenly the United States shows up with the Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group, which is a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. And then an accompanying Marine Amphibious Ready Group shows up and joins up with the TR in the southern South China Sea, and they start heading for this island. Well, a couple things happened then. One, those 190 ships, which had been sitting there for about 2 weeks, they start bailing. They get underway like that day and start leaving in 10s and 20s because the Chinese realize it's like, wait, I've just forced them to respond and I'm not comfortable with their response. Am I really willing to ratchet this up? There's another thing that's hanging out there right now that I think the Chinese are very concerned about. There's been a lot of conversation in the United States and in the West about boycotting the 2022 Olympics, the Winter Olympics. And the Chinese are desperate to have that Olympics. They want, again, to be recognized as a great power, and they do not want anyone staying away. First of all, it's a loss in diplomatic face for them if we boycott. The other thing, tremendous economic hit if we don't show up. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in economic activity. We all know, like, there's this discussion about moving our All-Star game out of Georgia. And we know what the dollar sign was associated with that move. And so that's kind of like the Olympics, but the Olympics are the All-Star game on steroids. It lasts weeks, and there's hundreds and billions of dollars to go into that. So the Chinese, I think, are going to take a lower profile, at least until their Winter Olympics is over. They don't want to risk that going forward. And I think that they're going to tampen down their activities for the next year and a half.
Yeah, and I would have to imagine that because their Summer Olympics were so successful that they want to do at least that and probably more to show the world, that they're here. So, anything less than what happened with the Summer Olympics, anything less than that would obviously
that's a failure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that totally fascinates me here about what we were just talking about, because I'm reading articles. This is very recently, that today's current environment with Russia, China, the US, today's current environment is very reminiscent of 1914, right at the beginning of World War I, that all that needs to happen is one of these minor little areas kind of pops up, and then all of a sudden the entire world's going in and backing allies all over the world. And you had mentioned earlier that if something were to happen in the South China Sea, then obviously Russia would probably jump to their aid, and something would happen in Eastern Europe, and now all of a sudden we're fighting a two-front war. Is it the same? Is it the opposite is true as well? If something were to happen in the Crimea, where we're bringing ships into the Black Sea right now, and all of a sudden that area pops up around the Ukraine, will China then be like, okay, it's our turn to kind of start poking and prodding Vietnam, Philippines, Japan? I mean, is that, and then from there, then it just starts circling the drain, I would imagine, in terms of the entire world coming into that.
So it's interesting. So for instance, we're not putting the two ships into the Black Sea. There was an announcement yesterday that we're not going to send those two destroyers simultaneously in the Black Sea. We're going to sort of step back from that because with Putin massing troops on the border, eastern border of Ukraine, I think the decision was, I don't want to keep poking that bear at the same time I'm dealing with the Chinese over here. We want to be a little more sequential in how we're going to approach these things and take a closer look. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think that you should, if you're going to announce that I'm sending a ship to the Black Sea, you send that ship to the Black Sea, because now there's an expression of a loss of face on our part, that we announced we're going to go, and then they, through diplomatic or military coercion, were able to convince us not to. So I think free seas and demonstration of free seas are fairly important things. But you mentioned 1914 and sort of what happens there, where the alliance structure sort of triggers these actions. Now, the United States today has 49 treaty allies, 48 of which are across oceans. Canada is the only treaty ally that we actually share a border with. Oddly enough, we don't have a security treaty with Mexico. So all these things require, and when I say treaty, understand that a ratified treaty under the Constitution has the power of constitutional law. So once the Senate confirms a treaty by 2/3 vote, it's essentially, think about as a legal document that's amended to the U.S. Constitution, committing us constitutionally to go to the aid of our ally under the terms of that treaty. So we have 48 different allies that are out there that could trigger that we have to come to their aid if something happens. There's 29 nations in NATO, that's clearly half of our treaty right there. And then you got Japan, you got South Korea, you got the Philippines. The Philippines is actually our oldest treaty ally in the Pacific. We signed a treaty with them shortly after World War II. So these nations, because of their security concerns, have the ability to kind of commit the United States, as long as they're not the flagrant aggressor in an issue. Their actions, if there's attack upon them under treaty, we're required to come to their aid. So it's kind of an interesting thing. China essentially has no treaty partners. They have an agreement with Russia, but they don't have treaty partners. And Russia, by the way, also has never gone in with a treaty alliance, except for its time as the Soviet Union, when the Warsaw Pact, was a treaty alliance in many ways. But Russia itself, historically, it does not have that strong of a network. But they have each other, and they both recognize right now it's in their interest to work together. So that's why I think that if someone else triggers the U.S. to get involved, China or Russia are going to move against the other aspect of U.S. vulnerability. So if Russia does something in Ukraine and we get invoked under Article 5 of the NATO treaty and we start having to flow forces there, then China's going to look at that as an invitation to make their movement probably against Taiwan, which is their most proximate foreign policy goal. So this is my level of concern. What's interesting about this is this is really just bad diplomacy on our part. I mean, it's been an accepted norm of us since Nixon's administration that we always want to keep China and Russia in balance against each other. That, if Russia becomes too great, we tip towards China. If China becomes too great, we tip towards Russia, and we try to keep them in balance. But over the last 4 years, essentially Russia became sort of a huge boogeyman in U.S. politics. We haven't been able to really see Russia clearly because we just view it as the enemy. Same thing with China. And so we've kind of created an environment where they've come together. Now, there is another player now, and we're just slowly waking up to this. India. India's 940 million people and a growing economic entity that sits on China's southwestern border, and they don't get along. And so when we talk about the Quad, which is really the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, then we're talking about working more closely with the Indians to strengthen them, to help them with their strategy. They have a lot of conflicts of interest with the Chinese. I mean, it wasn't less than 6 months ago, they were beating each other with shovels in the Himalayas because the Chinese made an incursion into Indian territory, and they just don't get along. I would think that quietly encouraging the Indians to strengthen themselves on China's border creates a strategic distraction for the Chinese to make them understand. I will also tell you, I take the geopolitically unpopular stand that leaving Afghanistan for the United States is a mistake, because Bagram Air Force Base, or Bagram Air Base, it's not a U.S. Air Force Base, but Bagram Air Base is 12,000 feet of runway on China's western border. And so if I had B-52s or B-1s sitting there loaded up with long-range missiles, that forces the Chinese to spend on their western perimeter And now that we're leaving, that means that China is now free to take all that money, that manpower, that resources, and focus it back on their east, the other axis of approach that they have to be worried about. Bagram was, Afghanistan's uncomfortable. We've lost 2,300 American lives there, some of whom I know. So, I recognize we have a sunk cost investment there, but I think there's always a geostrategic argument that we have to look at. A nation that sits literally at the center of the world, looking north into Russia, looking west or eastward into China. Leaving it right now doesn't make a lot of geostrategic sense to me. But it's sort of a slow bleeder for us, and we want to tie that off and get out of there.
Yeah. And now I do not expect you to answer this if you don't want to. I just have to say it because I find it fascinating. Obviously, I'm a Trump fan. My impression is the new administration is easing up on China, and that's just one of those things. Announcing we're leaving in 5 months, we're leaving Afghanistan, we're leaving that air base. So now all you have to do is worry about hitting Indians over the head with shovels at the border. My impression is that we're loosening up on China when we should be tightening the screws even more.
Well, the one thing I will say, President Trump made it very clear he was uncomfortable with remaining in Afghanistan for long term. He was uncomfortable with forever wars, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan. He wanted to bring the boys home. Yeah. And so in many ways, this is a continuation. I made my statements about Afghanistan to Trump administration officials at the time, thinking it was not geostrategically smart, that we needed to make sure if you're making this decision, understand what you're losing. But the one thing I do watch very closely, I think the Biden administration is being tested in a very real way right now. There's both Russia and China are testing Joe Biden personally and individually. They did the same thing, by the way, with President Trump. They did the same thing with President Obama. They always test new leaders, but they're seeing how strong and resilient you are on these things. So when the Chinese essentially upbraided and yelled at Biden's Secretary of State at the Anchorage meeting, that was a test. But I will tell you, I've been actually surprised that Biden administration officials like Blinken and General Austin, Secretary Austin, have come back with some fairly strong language and some fairly strong actions. So I remain hopeful that the Biden administration continues what I believe to be a realistic, pragmatic approach to the world. I will tell you, first of all, I'm going to make this statement right now. I believe the climate is changing. My daughter is a paleontologist. 400 million years of fossil record tell me the climate changes, okay? But I do not believe that climate change is my number one strategic priority in the world today. So I still think that China and Russia, rank up here, and dealing with the climate is a little bit lower down on that scale. So I get a little uncomfortable when we start talking about the importance of climate summit meetings. And it's like, okay, great, have your meeting, but do not sacrifice U.S. national interests against what is the largest polluter in the world, China, right. And let them off easy. We need to keep the focus on what it is that they're after, and they are after first regional and then global hegemony.
Yeah. A couple of things I've been writing notes as you're talking here. Yeah. First one is this. Let's either the U.S., Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, let's just say one of those has had enough, and they, just to send a message, hit one of the Spratly Islands, hit one of those air bases that are just out there in the middle of the ocean. And China starts getting ready to come back at whoever did that. According to The Hague, like we were just talking about, it's not necessarily Chinese territory, so they don't necessarily have a legal leg to stand on. Would that agreement, that non-treaty agreement between China and Russia, is that strong enough to bring Russia into that type of a situation? Because it seems to me that would be the most, like we were talking about, that's the easiest thing to do to really let them know that we're serious, is to hit something like that isn't theirs, although they think it is. Yeah.
So I think that what they're going to wait for is the U.S. to commit a preponderance of forces. And once the U.S. commits, which, by the way, we can't afford to wait a long time on. If there's going to be an action, we have to commit early in order to make sure that have a reasonable hope that we can end the war quickly as well. So they'll wait for that commitment, and then the other guy will move. Once we move towards the Pacific, Russia moves in Europe. If we move towards Europe, then China moves in the Pacific. They'll wait for us to commit because they're making the bet that the size U.S. military right now is not sufficient to be able to cover a two-front Europe and Western Pacific war. And that's a pretty good bet. But they'll wait for us to move first, and then they'll go after the other person.
Gotcha. And that's actually a great segue back into the reason why you wrote this book in last December. And that is, you feel that the Navy is not big enough to handle that type of scenario happening. And my question is this: could the United States get away with better quality, better capability, or are they better served with just quantity?
So it has to be the balance. I mean, that's what I get into. That's why I constantly talk about this high-low mix. We have two essential missions in the U.S. Navy, and we're unique. None of the other services, and when I say this, by the way, the Marine Corps is part of it because it's part of the Department of the Navy. The U.S. Navy has a provide the peace naval presence requirement that's built into its mission set. We have to be out and about, sort of patrolling the highways and byways of the global international trade routes. So there's these 18 maritime regions of the world have been identified by the regional COCOMs, and you know what those are. It's Central Command, it's U.S. European Command, Southern Command, Indo-Pacific Command, we used to call that PACOM. So these four-star generals and admirals out there say, I need a Navy ship and I need to come by here and I needed to dwell this long to demonstrate U.S. interest in the region. And so they set these requirements. So those requirements, you add them up, that's 150 ships a day. And we only have 297 ships, so we can't keep that amount out. We really struggle to keep just around 100 ships out on a day-to-day basis. And so that gap between 100 and 150, that's sort of our deficit right now. That's where China and Russia are operating, is in that gap point. But that's our day-to-day preserve the peace, cop on the beat, presence force. And no other military service. The Air Force doesn't have a presence requirement. The Army certainly doesn't have a presence requirement. The U.S. Navy has to deploy in peacetime, day in, day out. That's Navy and Marine Corps, because we're out there doing that. Now, the other part of this is we have to have the win the war force, okay? At the high end, I've got those ballistic missile submarines that carry nuclear weapons that if someone jumps ugly with me and launches the nukes, well, I've got a survivable third leg of the nuclear triad that's going to come from under the ocean. And you may have hit me today, but you're not breathing tomorrow. So that's part of that strategic deterrent force. But in the really real sense, those 11 nuclear powered aircraft carriers, that has been my win the war force. That if you jump ugly against me, I'm going to be launching my carriers with their air wings, and they're going to come and they're going to hit you. And I'm going to have that ability to win the high-end fight. Now, we've added over the last 30, 40 years, submarines, which all are carrying these Tomahawk missiles,
right,
to that win the war force. So we're not totally dependent on aircraft carriers anymore. But what we have to do is we have to have a balance between that maintain the peace force and the win the war force. And we have to keep that dynamically in balance. And we've allowed that to kind of get out. Right now, we're really leaning towards the win the war force. By law, we have to maintain 11 aircraft carriers and their accompanying strike groups. That's in law. You have to have 11 aircraft carriers. And so we went from having over 100 frigates in the Navy to having 0. We have 0 frigates today. And so now we're just starting to build frigates again. Again, that's that presence force, the day-to-day maintain the peace force. Right. And we've been doing things like using our Marine amphibious groups, splitting up those 3 ships to go out and provide presence rather than keeping them together as a coherent military fighting force. We have to kind of bring those things back into balance, rebuild the frigates, and make sure that we sort of have that balance going forward. That's why when I detail this graph in the back of the book, it adds up to 456 ships.
Now, this is actually a very interesting question, and that is, what would be our end state? I just don't see like the end of World War II where China is just a smoldering ruin and, they won't bother us for the next 40, 50 years as we try to help them rebuild after a devastating war? Or is it just push it to a stalemate where they push back or where they pull back and say, okay, we're not gonna expand our presence into a certain area? Is it going to be an all-out war, or is it just going to be kind of, hey, get back into your lane type of a thing?
So I don't think that we can afford an all-out war. We certainly don't want an all-out war. They're a nuclear power. We're a nuclear power. I don't want to be landing U.S. Marines on Chinese, the land war in Asia.
Right.
But what I do want to do is I want to remind them where they are in the world, and I want them to become what we've been talking about for 70 years. I want the Chinese to become a mature, reasonable actor within the global international system that we have worked so hard to build. Okay, they don't want that. They think that the global international system has been biased against them and more biased towards us. The system is set up to kind of keep us in charge. That's their view. They want a system where there's more of a centrally controlled global economy that's under Chinese purview and direction. And we need to point out that, look, a nation that has no natural resources and not a large enough market to buy its own goods doesn't get to set the rules. So if you want to come out and play, you're going to play by our rules. So if China jumps ugly, if something goes down with Taiwan, then my recommendation, the strategy that I suggest, is that you cut them off from their supplies and you stop buying their stuff and you sink their ships. If they want to move their ships, then we sink the Chinese Navy as much as we can away from their mainland, and we be prepared to go internal, go autarkic. Have our economy run on its own internal supplies for as long as we can until they kind of come to their senses. I don't want to destroy their economy. I do not want to kill 1.4 billion people. That's not where we're at as a people. But I need to understand that if they want to be part of the global system, they need to be part as a responsible actor within the system that's been created.
And obviously, it seems like right now that the centrally controlled communist state, that can't happen. There are two diametrically opposed philosophies, and that's same. I guess same goes with Russia in Eastern Europe as well.
Again, it comes back to the concept of the free sea as an indicator. It's a litmus test. The Chinese right now, there was always a carve out in the free sea, and you may remember this from the book, that this idea of the territorial sea. And at the time, nations said, okay, I can't control the entire ocean, but I want to control at least what's right next to me. And so there was this thing called the 2 cannon shot rule, that the distance as far as a cannonball could go times 2 was your allowed territorial sea. Well, the Chinese are now saying, hey, look, I got missiles that can range out 1,000 miles. So under that legal exception, going back 5 centuries, can I not claim territorial seas out several hundred miles? If I can control it from my weapons ashore, is it not my territory? That's part of their argument about the South China Sea. It's part of their argument about the East China Sea. We cannot allow that to stand, because that's not just the control of maritime trade, it's also the control of ideas. The Chinese super freak out about the ideas of individual liberty and freedom making their way into their own national life, because that will undermine the Chinese Communist Party. And so we need that freedom. And if their system is not resilient enough to stand up, in sort of the court of ideas, then perhaps it's time for that system to be moved aside. And what we know, and this is what's interesting, we know that Chinese people can live and work in a free economic system. We know that because look at the success of Taiwan. A Chinese population that left that country 50 years ago, 70 years ago, moved to Taiwan, and now has a growing, robust economy that's individual liberty with democracy. We know it can work. That's why the Chinese are so freaked out about Hong Kong first last year and now Taiwan, is because it's a proof that there is an alternative to the centrally controlled government that they have at home.
And you can't hide that. Exactly.
No.
And the only way to control 1 billion people is you got to control them with a sledgehammer, as opposed to
at least that's what they think.
Yeah.
But India's got 940 million people that tell you there's an alternative there.
Back to India real quick. Do we have a written treaty with them, or is that no? We don't.
No,
Okay.
they are non-aligned, but we are building a relationship based upon mutual respect and cooperation. So we do an annual exercise with them at sea with the Indian Navy called Malabar, where, and it's one of the biggest exercises we do every year, where we're working alongside them and we're integrating, we're learning how to communicate, we're learning how their ships operate, how their weapons operate. We need to create those exercises that build mutual trust with the Indians, because we're going to need them someday.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So here we go. Break out your crystal ball here. Is the Biden administration and the current Secretary of Defense, are they starting to see that we need to build the Navy? Where are we in terms of that?
We'll know a little bit more within the next 2 weeks. And when I see the budget come out and whether that budget significantly pluses up the Navy, under this 759 number, we got to see the actual build rate, then we'll get a better sense. I hope so. I mean, they appointed Kathleen Hicks as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Kathleen Hicks, in her testimony, talked about the importance of growing the Navy. Right now, General Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's an Army general, has said we need to grow the Navy, even if it's at the expense of the Army. So I think that there's leadership there that's recognizing that this growing global competition is maritime in nature, and that you need to emphasize naval power. We're just going to see whether it comes manifest in that first budget. And that budget's late. By the way, we don't even have a Secretary of the Navy named or nominated yet. That will be a key indicator. You show me who that person is, and I'll tell you how serious they are. If it's a committed navalist who understands the Navy and naval power, maybe someone who had a background as a naval officer or a Marine, or even an enlisted guy. We've got a lot of qualified candidates who've had more than enough experience, successful in the business world, that could come back in and serve. I will know a lot more here real soon, but I can tell you right now, I don't know yet, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
And what happens if, let's discuss both these. What happens if it comes back and it's disappointing?
Well, then there's going to be a lot of criticism. There's going to be a lot of criticism from China hawks such as myself, but I'm here to tell you there's going to be a lot of criticism on Capitol Hill too, where even Democratic voices like Congressman Joe Courtney, who is the chairman of the House Sea Power Subcommittee, a Democrat, or Representative Elaine Luria, who is the Virginia 2nd District Representative, who's the vice chairman of the overall House Armed Services Committee. Both of these people, Democrats, and are committed navalists. They want to see the Navy grow. And so if the administration hands down a budget that doesn't have a significant plus up, you're going to see, I believe, a growing bipartisan consensus behind the idea of growing the Navy and finding the dollars to do that. So, the question is whether the Biden administration wants to fight voices from inside its own party or not. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see a larger Navy bill or spending bill when it all comes out of the National Defense Authorization Act, when it makes its way through Congress.
And will that number, whatever it is, whether it's higher or lower, whether it's disappointing or it gives some hope, how are China and Russia going to react to that? So let's say it is less than what people think it should be. How does that impact what they start doing? Do they start doing more around there, or what do you think happens then?
Well, like I said, I think China wants to play it low and slow for the next year and a half until they get past their Olympics. But that being said, I think the Chinese feel that they're on a clock. There was a reason that Admiral Davidson, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the Indo-Pacific Command, came back and said that he fears that there might be a Chinese move against Taiwan within the next 6 years.
Really?
Yes, he made that in testimony in front of the Congress. And there's a reason for that. I think a lot of these trends that I was talking about earlier, demographics, economics, and military power competition, are all coming to a head, and they're coming to a head sooner rather than later. Originally, I was worried that the window for conflict was going to open like in 2026 and close about 2032. I think that window is being pulled forward right now because of the nature of the global competition. And this isn't 1914. This is actually 1936, 38, 39, where it was the sanctions that we took against the Japanese and cutting off their oil supplies that kind of forced World War II, at least in the Pacific. We may be facing just those types of economic trends where the global economic competition becomes a reason that China feels that they have to break out and establish at least their local sphere of influence in the Western Pacific.
And now, flip side of the coin, let's say the budget comes back and it's the Navy's, it's nice for the Navy. And now you guys are feeling optimistic. what happens then? Are we cranking out 2 ships a year? How does that increase the number of ships in your mind? And how fast would it take to ramp up to where you see it being an acceptable number based on what's going on around the world?
Takes 2 years to really move the needle on shipbuilding. So right now we're building 1 destroyer a year in Maine and in Mississippi. We're building 1 submarine a year in Groton, Connecticut, another down at Huntington Ingalls. If we ask them to double that, it's going to take them at least a couple of years to be able to hire the personnel. You know, you can't just go from 1 shift to 2 shifts to 3 shifts. You got to go find qualified welders, qualified electricians. By the way, I want to just make this point because I come from a blue collar background. I grew up on a farm in northern Indiana in the middle of the Rust Belt. And so my cousins are truck drivers and factory workers, the people that I grew up around. And so the thing to understand is that if you're going to build ships in the United States, this is actually how you get your industrial base back. So what does it take to build a ship? Well, you need welders, you need steel makers, you need pipe fitters, you need electricians, you need heating, air conditioning people. For every job created in a U.S. Navy shipyard or in a shipbuilding yard, you create 6 to 7 jobs downstream in individual part suppliers. So if you want to grow your industrial base back, if you want to invest in infrastructure, then grow your shipyards. All right. If you want to grow the type of working class jobs that allow a person to graduate from high school and then be able to buy a home and raise a family, then you want to build things like ships, because that's the type of thing. You can be an 18-year-old who starts out making $45,000 a year. In a few years, you're making $72,000 a year building ships. They're union jobs. I held 2 union cards in my lifetime. I have some problems with unions in sort of a way, but at the same time, I'm not opposed to them. But the fact of the matter is shipbuilding is sort of intrinsic to our national security, but it's also intrinsic to our American way of life. That's how you actually do middle class, the old fashioned way.
Yeah, this is, it's the Navy, and we almost take it for granted, and a lot of people do, just how important it is. And you're seeing that in what's going on all around the world. So I really appreciate your inputs on this. A lot of the stuff you were talking about today, I found fascinating, and I definitely want to have you on for some other conversations. But to kind of close it out here, if people are interested in learning a little bit more about you and about your book, where would they go? Is there a website that we can send them to kind of learn a little bit more about this, or where can they buy the book?
Well, you can go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble and find it. I mean, it's Henry J. Hendrix. My mother and dad called me Henry, and everyone else calls me Jerry. To provide and maintain a Navy, why naval power is America's first best strategy. And you can find that, anywhere. And I appreciate it if you do. The book is, I wrote the book to be short enough to be read essentially in a weekend. So it's only 110 pages long. I wanted to make it accessible. I wanted to make it something that could be read by people outside of the Church of the Navy, as it were, so that, like I told you, my cousins and the people that I grew up with back home could read it, and maybe that would understand why the Navy is important today. If you're interested in speaking to me, if you want to talk to me about naval power or national security, you can contact me, via the Telemus Group, which is where I work as a vice president and consultant there, and that's just telemusgroup.com. You can find us online. But we do, national security forecasting and analysis, and I appreciate the chance to speak with you all. We live in interesting times, to use that ancient Chinese curse. And I'm, trying to think ahead of what this looks like 10 years down the road. And I'm just here to tell you, it doesn't look good right now.
Yeah. And I think the United States has never really been very good at paying heed to the little kid up on the hill crying wolf.
Yeah.
And they get distracted with the latest bright and shiny thing over here, while the people in the background are hopefully trying to protect us. So we'll see, but it's a great, this puts meat on all of those stories that you're hearing in the news right now. So I really appreciate your time, Jerry, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Well, thank you, Rainman. This has been great to be on, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Absolutely. And I'll close it out by saying, if you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. Jerry Hendrix, thank you again, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, Observations on the World We Live In. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.